Our next plenary is on understanding and interpreting the American electorate. And I believe this is one that is incredibly interesting to us and important. Unfortunately, on this one, we will not have time at the end for the question and answer with this plenary. But we could not have a group of stronger speakers to address this role. We have the best in this today. The role of culture and immigration in the 2018 election cycle, and to explore how the election results will affect and impact the immigration landscape. Our moderator for this particular panel, and then I will ask her to introduce her panel. Our moderator is Molly Ball, the national political correspondent at Time. Molly, will you please come out and may we give you a hand? And we'll ask your panel to go ahead and come on out, and you may go ahead and introduce them as they are seated. Thank you very much. We're looking forward to what you have to say.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Thanks for being part of the audience today. I'm Molly, and we have an all-immigrant panel here, except for me. We've got here Tim Dixon, the co-founder of More in Common, and the author of the Hidden Tribes Report. Tim splits his time between London and New York, as I understand it. Kevin Murphy, the CEO of Driscoll's, the berry company that my children love to eat. It's an international company in more than 30 countries, but with 70,000 workers in the United States alone, and based in California. And Lomi Kriel, an immigration reporter for the Houston Chronicle, who has covered a lot of border issues and immigration issues. She is based in Houston. So what I'm going to do first is, these people obviously have perspectives that inform their views on this issue. And so I'd like each of you to just talk a little bit about what insight you feel you have into immigration, particularly as a political issue, because of the work that you do. Tim?
Thanks. Well, I think the important thing to understand for particularly those of us who are involved in advocacy work and trying to shift the immigration debate is, it comes out of the Hidden Tribes Report, which we just released a few weeks ago. Big study, 8,000 people, a year-long study of attitudes across the US, is that attitudes around immigration are kind of downstream, and more fundamental beliefs and values and sort of people's sense of tribal identity and attachment and so forth is more upstream. So we've done this typology of the country in terms of the issues that are going on right now. And we didn't find the sort of the two tribes of liberals and conservatives. We found 7. And a lot more nuance between the kind of extremes that are very tribal and are very active and driving the debate and dominating the debate, and a much larger group in the middle that we call the exhausted majority. Now, that group, the exhausted majority, who sort of really feel turned off by the polarisation in the country and feel kind of left out of the conversation, they're a lot more common sense on issues. And so on immigration issues, you find that they kind of lean towards, I think a lot of the conversation that we've had this morning here kind of would resonate with that majority. But the challenge is that we're being given a very kind of strong binary choices between a very hard conservative nationalist message and a very aggressive progressive message, and that just doesn't resonate with those groups in the middle. So I don't think that the story of this middle today is a story of the kind of the centrists of simply drawing a line between these two sides. I think that they're very distinctly very unhappy with the country. They feel that the system isn't working, but they don't sort of want to choose between these extremes. And in that sense, I think there is a reason for hope. What we need is in the political system, we need to be able to get beyond this sort of hyper-partisan situation where there's even when you've got overwhelming public support for comprehensive immigration reform, for example, DACA, You can't make that progress because of this partisanship, because of this refusal to compromise. So there's real structural impediments for us getting beyond the deadlock that we're in. But the public, the majority, would like to see that happen.
Kevin, what's your perspective on all this?
So my perspective is, obviously we're, I think, the largest agricultural employer in California, perhaps even in the whole of the United States. So, from a business perspective, there's clearly a need and a requirement to get to a solution, which is, partly guest worker program and some legal status for those folks that work here right now. So there's obviously a business element to why I'm standing up here. But for me, it's much more personal. I'm an immigrant myself. I came to the United States 30 years ago, and for me, the American dream has been one where I literally came here with no money in my pocket, and have been very fortunate to be able to work my way up through it and become CEO of a pretty substantial company that impacts the lives of many people through some great products, and so I'm very, very fortunate. And personally, I look across in many of the thousands of acres of fields that we have and see similar type immigrants who've come here 20, 30 years ago. And in them, I see the same kind of hard work. I see the same kind of dedication to the country. I see that ethos of being good citizens. And so it becomes a moral issue for me around making sure that we treat these people with the same kind of dignity and respect that I felt like I got treated as an immigrant coming here 30 years ago. So in this whole effort, it's become for myself personally and our company one more of a moral issue than anything else, is that this country was built on immigrants. We need to think of immigrants as valuable people, and they provide a lot of the labor that puts the food in our stomachs, and in so many ways is central to the success of this country. So for me, mine's a personal one, and as a company, we're stepping forward here and trying to create a bipartisan coalition of both the right and the left, various groups from faith all the way to trade unions, because we think, as Tim said, there's this reason to exist, and if we can get broad consensus across a wide group of people, we think we can influence, with others, of course, the political narrative. So that's partly why I'm here and why I feel so strongly about it.
Lomi, how long have you been covering immigration, and what kinds of things have you seen in that process?
So my context is I came to the U.S. as an immigrant as well 20 years ago, and have been mostly in Texas since then, but I've also spent quite a lot of time at the Mexican border, in Mexico, and in Central America, but have been in Houston covering immigration on a statewide level for the last 5 years. So it's been really interesting to watch Texas also sort of evolve on the issue of immigration. It was largely pretty moderate under President Bush, and even Governor Perry, who was the first to push legislation giving in-state tuition for undocumented immigrants. And then to see how that's really kind of shifted in the past couple of years, to hear more of this sort of divisive rhetoric that we're seeing now. Houston's also the most diverse city in the country, so the differences between kind of the urban areas in Texas, Houston, Dallas, San Antonio, and Austin, and the rest of the state is also extremely stark and interesting in terms of the feelings on immigration.
And the politics, certainly, there's a big Democratic sweep in Houston, correct?
Right,
in
yes.
The suburban areas and the judges?
It was a complete Democrat sweep. I mean, in Houston, all the urban areas in Texas this election, but particularly in Houston, where Democrats won every down-ballot election. So
I want to talk about the midterms. What role do you think immigration played in that election in Texas? In Houston specifically, in the statewide races, the Senate, the governor's race, was it a big topic?
So there was a CNN poll that showed that 72% of voters who went for Senator Ted Cruz, who was the Republican, said that immigration was one of their top issues, but only 27% of voters who went for the Democrat, Beto O'Rourke, said that it was a big deal to them. So I think that might be somewhat consistent with what we're seeing across the country, where it was really only in the past couple of weeks in Texas that Ted Cruz made the caravan and the wall an issue, because the wall is actually not that popular in Texas, because people don't find, they've been living on the border, they see that it may not be the best solution. So it was interesting to see, as the president kind of kept talking more about the caravan, then the governor and Senator Cruz started talking more about the caravan. And I was at the Cruz victory party, and every person there mentioned the wall and the caravan as one of the most important issues. When, I think when you look statewide, that might not be the case. I mean, Cruz only won by 2.7%, which maybe in the rest of the country doesn't seem that amazing, but Texas hasn't had such a close election since 1990. So, Beto O'Rourke only won by about 200,000 votes. So it really shows that the margin of victory there was just a small counties, mostly rural Anglo counties and suburban counties, that went for him and was the ultimate decider.
And as you mentioned, the president talked a lot about immigration and campaigned very aggressively, especially in the final weeks leading up to the midterm election, talking about this caravan, which he blew up into something that factually it was not, talking about the wall, as he always does, bringing up birthright citizenship, throwing that in there. Do you, Kevin, think that this election was a referendum, as the president would have liked to make it, on the immigration issue specifically? And if so, what was the verdict that was delivered?
Yeah, I'm kind of in between on this one. Obviously, living in California, looks like another state at some level in terms of our thinking and how we go about stuff. But I think, what you saw was a pushback against all of the rhetoric and against all of these different types of items and whatever. I don't, California, just like Texas, we don't see the wall or immigrants as being a big issue. So in California, I think it was a little different. I'm interested in the result and what that means for us going forward, right? So, the Democratic House and, a slightly more Republican Senate, I'm actually kind of encouraged by the idea that we can get this bipartisan stuff going. Certainly, where I'm from and where we're focused on is this idea that we've got these guest workers that we are bringing in, and we're bringing more of them in, and it seems to be working at some level, even though still 80% of the workers are mostly domestic in nature. But I'm worried about that population that's under siege in terms of, the ICE raids. There's a lot of stuff going on there, and that population, I think, is going to be marginalized further in the next couple of years. And it's going to have an impact on communities. I think the communities are going to be under stress, and that's where, law enforcement, faith, companies, a lot of us can come together to try and get something moving in this direction, because as people are pushed into the shadow economy, that's going to have a dramatic impact on communities. And I see that as the real sort of rallying cry. And I think Democrats are excited about creating solutions there. I think Republicans have an opportunity to participate, and obviously ag tends to be more conservative and Republican nature, so we can play a role in helping Republicans see the value of that. And I think if we can create some sort of pathway to legal status for these domestic workers, we can stabilize the communities. We can get the Republicans there, and I think and then give the president some assurance around security, whether it be some form of wall or E-Verify. It seems like there's something for everybody here, and that's what I'm most excited about, is how do we all come together from all these different areas with common goals and common understanding, and become a force for change. And I think there's enough there for everybody, and my hope is that we build broader coalitions, bipartisan coalitions from groups that would be unlikely partners except for immigration, because immigration is such a common goal for all of us. So I like to think of it, what does this position us for the future, and how can we continue to focus on those things that bring us together rather than those things that separate us?
Well, Tim, you've studied the American electorate in a very deep and nuanced way over the long term. A couple of questions about that. Following on what Kevin said, do you see an American electorate that is coming apart or coming together in its trajectory? And did the midterms complicate or maybe illustrate your research in any way?
Yeah, I think that there's a set of forces happening in society more generally that are fracturing us and fragmenting us. And that's everything from the loss of neighbourliness and sort of sense of local connection, social isolation. And equally, and I think just as dangerously on the progressive side, a pro-refugee, pro-immigrant position has become so strident. I mean, we literally get 95, 98, 99% agreement with different propositions on both sides. So it then becomes part of this larger context of constant, tribal warfare between these two sides. It's not going to be easy to break out of that. But two things that can be effective, I think, and impactful. One is not just focusing on the mobilisation of those sort of progressive liberal groups. They're totally bought in now with the sort of immigration reform and refugee issues, more than ever before. But we need, on the conservative side, the moderate and conservative side, to find those allies. And so I think that's where faith is particularly important, because it's what's distinctive in the traditional devoted conservative groups is they are, they're very religious. Like there's a very, literally, we even asked how many times people pray every day. And there's a linear relationship across the 7 tribes, which is fascinating. Very secular at one end and very devoted at the other end. But those groups that can kind of break away from this hostile, us against them nationalist force and embody the traditional sort of welcoming values and of hospitality are really important. The other thing is the American narrative, the pluralist narrative, the idea out of many one, remains strong, but people aren't hearing that unifying message. They're hearing an identity politics message from the far right and from the far left, and not hearing a bigger story of us. And I think that's the potential is still there. In fact, I think there's a real hunger for it. But it's just, that feels to me like the opportunity. A bigger story of us that brings people together and that emphasises our commonality rather than our differences.
Well, Kevin, I've been covering this issue for more than a decade, and so much doesn't seem to have changed. There's always been this sort of silent majority in favor of immigration reform in the broad strokes. The solutions being proposed haven't really changed, some combination of path to legalization and increasing security on the border. So and yet you say you have some optimism, you have some hope. I would say that is a rather counter-conventional wisdom position at this point, to have hope for bipartisanship in Washington especially. What gives you that optimism? Where do you see something breaking loose and allowing forward movement at long last?
Well, hope springs eternal, right? So it's gotta be, maybe it's somewhat naive, maybe somewhat simplistic, but the amount of people that participate in these midterms and the amount of people that have a perspective and an issue on this is something unprecedented, for at least 50 years or more, probably in the history of the country. So that gives me hope that people are engaged, they're interested, they want to understand, they want to listen. So if we can take advantage of that engagement right now and have open conversations in which we listen and learn from each other in forums like this and others, we can make, and if we can build off that engagement that we have, that gives me the hope, right? So you feel like you're not speaking to people that are unengaged. There's a vastly engaged group of people in this country that I think want to, as we've said many times here, want a solution, want to see the best of us, want to see this country be something that the rest of the world actually holds us up to. We want to meet that ideal. I'm as I said, an immigrant. I feel that way intensely, and I just think the times right now, we've got an engaged group of citizens, and we need to take advantage of it. So.
Well, Lomi, you're on the ground in Texas, and there's so many myths being perpetuated about immigration and about what's happening on the border. What is your sense of what people who are closer to the issue actually believe about this issue?
You mean kind of Texans that live not at the border?
Texans in general, or even nationally, I'm sure you've reported as well. What's your sense of the view from the ground in terms of the electorate?
In terms of the election? Well, I mean, I think, it's just very much, and what happened in Texas now, it's this, and what we've been hearing, this kind of urban-rural divide where, all of the urban areas in Texas went for Democrats, and those are diverse areas where there are a lot of immigrants living there, versus the areas that went particularly, for Senator Cruz are Anglo counties, rural counties with very few immigrants for the large part. So I think, as you kind of get more immigrants into an area, the attitudes about immigration start changing because they're your neighbors, they go to your kids' schools. So, one example of that is Fort Bend County, which is just outside of Houston. It's the most diverse county in the country and was always, 100% Republican. It went for Hillary Clinton for the first time in 2016. And in this congressional election, the Republican incumbent won by just less than 5 points. And his opponent was an Indian American who campaigned in 13 languages. So, all of these races in areas where immigrants are changing kind of the demographics are becoming much closer.
Well, and as you mentioned, the Texas Republican Party has a long history of moderation and pro-immigration positions, but that's increasingly been pushed out of the party, and they've taken harder stands. Do you see Texas Republicans looking at what happened and going, oh geez, we got our butts kicked, we've got to tack to the center? Or is there more of a digging in, saying the way we're still winning is by being very vocal and strident on this issue?
Well, so like I said, I was at the Cruz Watch Party, and his campaign, his chief strategist, spoke about this issue to reporters after the race and said, look, what this race has taught us is we're going to have to look at the electorate differently because our margins were so slim in these suburban and rural counties. So, I think what happened in Texas, even though, the Democrats didn't win that race, is a real, it's a warning sign to Republicans that their margins there are narrowing, and it's not just a given. But that said, we're about to start the Texas legislative session in January, and the filing date for bills was last week, and there are already a bunch of anti-immigrant bills filed. So, I think we'll see what happens in the session sort of in the short term, but I think in the long term, Republican strategists know that they have to sort of change some of that rhetoric.
How about you, Kevin? You talked about seeing hope for progress. What are some of the specifics that you think politicians might be able to come to agreement on?
Immigration. I think it's one of those unifying areas, because certainly the politicians I speak to, and I get to speak to quite a few of them, is this sort of unifying issue that we are a country of immigrants. No one disagrees with that. We heard earlier today about the need for the right kind of immigration policy. We need, workers, both, semi-skilled and very skilled workers. If this country's going to, if the economy is going to continue to grow and be successful, we need the knowledge and we need the work. So if you're pro-business, there's all the reasons to do it, right? If you're pro-community, there's all the reasons to get it sorted out. If you're literally across the spectrum, if you're for families, if you're for law enforcement, if you're for all these issues, they all speak to a viable immigration policy. So that's the hope I have, is that there's place at this table for everybody, and that alone is very rare because a lot of the issues are deeper and broader than that. But I do think if we can get beyond the rhetoric and get to the fundamental issues and get that conversation out there, why immigration is good for business, why immigration is good for community, why immigration is good for law enforcement, why all these things, and getting a viable policy and legislation in place creates that. In our industry, there's sayings, the question is, if we don't get that done, foreign hands pick your fruits and vegetables. They're either here or they're in Mexico or in somewhere else. I'd much rather they were here in the US picking it. So that's one of the choices we have, is to say, how do we keep viable, industries going? And it's going to be, foreign hands, because for the most part, Americans don't want to pick fruits and vegetables. We are, at our company, doing a lot of work to try and make it easier to pick them, get them off the ground, make it pick faster. There were harvesters making $20 an hour this last summer. So it's not a low-paying job by any stretch. And if we can make it, I'd love to pay everybody $20 an hour, because then we can attract more workers. So there's lots of work going on in automation. There's lots of work going on around transforming the way we grow fruit, so we can pick it faster, people can make more money. There's a whole series of things there. But, the truth of the matter right now is foreign hands pick it, and I want to keep those foreign hands picking them here in the US in a way where they feel respected and valued.
Well, when you talk to politicians, when you talk to policymakers, you present them with, the policy imperative, the political imperative, the great number of constituencies for this issue. What's their excuse? What do they say is the reason they can't do it?
Well, go speak to those other guys. Go convince those other guys.
Everybody wants someone else to do it. Nobody
ones,
wants to take the lead.
Yeah.
Is that what it is?
Yeah. So there's obviously leadership in Congress, I think, is partly to blame. We have these very hardened things. If you look at the votes over the last 5 years on big issues, they're almost 100% Republican, 100% Democrat. Now, you go back 30 or 40 years, there were issues, but people were much more willing to move across the aisle and make decisions and vote in ways that their conscience sent them. And that's how you got some of this stuff worked out. So I think there's some of that leadership issue in Congress that gets in the way. And quite frankly, both Republicans and Democrats have told me that personally. I want to vote for this, but leadership doesn't want me to do it. I probably, quite often I hear that. So, how do we break that? How do we get it so that it's, that's where that bipartisan comes in. Because in the end, for this to work, you've got to legislate. And so we've got to make sure that people both on the right and the left that get into these seats in the House and the Senate are willing to participate in this. That's the way it gets done. There's no other way to do it. I mean, we need to create enough energy in the country in a bipartisan way, as well as influence folks on both sides of the aisle, that they've got to recognize that if you vote against immigration, is a consequence to that.
Well, Tim, how about that? I mean, do you, you talked about there's a message in the middle that's not being heard because of the extreme voices on either side. Where do you think that message should come from? Is it political leaders who should be broadcasting that more moderate message, or does it have to come from the grassroots, as Kevin's saying, and influence the politicians, push them? Where do you think that message starts?
Well, I think it's helpful to think about the different groups within the community, because it's very different for different groups. So on the conservative side, Fox is just enormously influential for what we call the traditional devoted conservatives. And as one pastor said to a friend of mine, I have my congregation for 2 hours a week, and Fox has them for 24 hours a day. So that's hugely influential for that group, and I think it's very specifically about conservative media outlets. But for the middle groups, which is 56% of the population, there's three quite distinct groups we find. Passive liberal group, which is essentially younger, more people of colour, more female, and they're very open on immigration issues, but they just tend not to participate because they don't have a lot of confidence that their voice will matter. I think a lot of those people got out and voted, and that made a big difference last week. We have a moderates, which is the traditional sort of more suburban, more female, who really recoil at the style of leadership of the president, and who are socially conservative and want to know particularly that the rules are being enforced on immigration, but are also quite humanitarian and quite sort of open, their perspective. But the other group, which I think is the most important in understanding what's different now to the past, is, we call them the politically disengaged. It's 26% of the population, it's a big group. They are marked more than anything else by no ideological coherence at all, and a deep suspicion, a very low level of social trust. They don't really have a strong political identity, but boy, on immigration, they're concerned. They're actually more hostile than a lot of the people on the conservative side. And in some ways, I think what President Trump has done is tap into this group, many of whom actually, again, most of them don't vote, but many more have come out to vote. And I'm sure that that's part of the midterm story as well. He's mobilising a group that often hasn't participated in the political process. How do you deal with that? It's a large group. It's the largest single group in the population. It's not the largest voting group, but it's significant enough to count. And their view of the world is just, they really feel that they're the people that J.D. Vance describes in Hillbilly Elegy or Hochschild's book, Stranger in My Own Land. They are socially dislocated. They reflect a deep set of social problems in the country. I don't think messaging particularly solves the problem with them. But I think there is something in showing to that group that they're being used to divide the country, that they're being played off, immigrants being played off against other groups to divide the country. And I think there might be a way with that group to talk about division and how they're being essentially manipulated to drive someone else's agenda. But I think that's again, they're really quite distinctive groups, and they hear these issues and think through these issues through quite different prisms.
And well, you talked about this being a downstream issue for people, and flowing from social attitudes and cultural attitudes. Do people want to do something about immigration fundamentally, or are they just, is it really not on their radar and they're more focused on the sort of kitchen table or other top-line concerns?
Well, I mean, real differences among the different groups, but I think that the noticeable thing among this sort of more people who have a high perception of threat or fear or feel insecure, it's within that context that a divisive story of there's a group of people who are taking things away from you that can resonate. And I think that's our challenge, is to break down that sense of the fear of the other. And it's deep for some groups in the community. And this, again, I think it's part of what's different now in the debate to what it has been in the past. It's not fundamentally about immigration. It's about us against them. It's about people feeling under siege, people feeling that their place in society is lost, that they don't have dignity, that they don't have a future. And there's a certain logic to it, even though it's technically wrong from an economist's point of view. If you don't know where the jobs are coming in your community, you wonder what jobs your kids are going to be doing. You kind of see people arriving in your community, and you go, what are these people doing here? Why are they letting them in? We don't even know the jobs the kids are going to have. Now, as we've heard this morning, of course, actually, immigration creates jobs and opportunity, but it's not the natural way that people think. And I think that explains a lot of what happened in the Midwest in 2016 in voting patterns. So I think that finding that way to address this deeper sense of dislocation and talking about these issues in ways that resonate to the moral values of people. So we did a lot of work on Jonathan Haidt's work on moral foundations, for example. It's really true in better understanding the frames through which people think about these issues. So it's more complex than talking about immigration. It's actually understanding people's values and their sense of where they sit in American society and what the future is like. And that's why I think that in the long run, we're making progress on these issues is part of more generally healing a very divided country.
Well, Lomi, we talked a little bit about Republican messaging, particularly in Texas, on immigration, but what about the Texas Democrats who are winning these elections, particularly in previously Republican areas? Are they talking about immigration, or do they prefer to avoid it, given that their voters apparently are less concerned about the issue? Is their message about open borders and abolishing ICE, or are they promoting a sort of old-fashioned immigration compromise, secure the border type of message? What do you hear from the Democrats in Texas?
Yeah, Texas Democrats are definitely not talking about abolishing ICE. That is a conversation that is happening elsewhere. They generally, wouldn't focus on immigration as much, other than to talk about finding some sort of solution for dreamers, and balancing border security, common sense border security, i.e. fencing and more agents, with some sort of pathway to a legal status and helping out, dreamers, kids who came here illegally with their parents.
Well, this is a hard thing to generalize, but I'm interested in, I've heard people make the case on immigration in different ways, talking about morality, talking about family separation as sort of a bleeding heart issue, if you will, versus convincing people that this will lift up the economy and make the jobs engine hum better. What of those messages, what do you hear more of from the sort of pro-immigration side? What do you think is more appealing to particularly voters in the middle?
Sorry, the options were persuading.
I guess
versus,
I'm wondering if people respond more, in your experience, to a moral message or to an economic message.
I think it really depends, as you guys have mentioned, who you speak to. Among the church community, there are actually many evangelical pastors with lots of Latinos in their congregations who talk about the moral obligation. But then if you talk to, the Texas Association of Business has been trying to sort of promote some type of immigration reform and certainly fixing the dreamer status, all this time. They have never wavered on that. So from the business standpoint, within business leaders, there is kind of this very sort of common sense economic approach that works with kind of their stakeholders, but on the people within the moral, the religious community, it's more of that moral sense.
I think it's personal.
Right.
It's what works in that community, and it's how you get to the hearts of people, right? So I don't think there's one size fits all here. I do think that if we're going to be successful in terms of getting this broader conversation going, it will take Fox News saying, there is a good side to this thing. We understand this, but there is this positiveness. It'll take various groups and constituents that otherwise wouldn't do it coming out in favor of some of this. So, to me, if we use one message, then we're going to fail.
Well, what about the president? We can't get through an entire political discussion and not talk about the president. What role do you think he is playing in this? What role do you think he could play in this?
I think there is a. I could guess what the president's going to do or say next tomorrow. I'd be a soothsayer, but my sense is that he cares deeply about the security of the country, in his own way, and I'm going to take him on his word, right? And that secure borders and a viable immigration, so that we can be sure that the people that are here legally. That is a fair request. Now you could argue, how do you do that right? That's always a debate, but I think we need to have secure borders at some level, and we need to be able to say people came here legally. Let's then say, let's reset the clock. Let's say, okay, let's create some status for those that were here that are obviously good people and they're part of our communities and they've done a good job of being part of it. Let's give them some status. Let's get the right kind of guest workers here to fill the needs, to grow the economy. Let's create some environment in which we can ensure that illegal immigration is reduced. I think that's the message. You just like the president has to be, we have to understand where he's coming from at some level and use sensible things. When we get into these camps, we can't win this. So my hope again is that there's something for him there. There's something for communities. There's different. This is one issue. I think we can find common ground. Will we? Time will tell. But it's going to take what I think is dialogue. It's listening to the other side. It's having finding. It's got to be a win-win for everyone. So that's my hope. And,
well, Tim, I'll give you the final word. going forward, cast us into the future. What's the trajectory of the trends that you're talking about? Do you see this issue becoming only more inflamed and more divisive, or do you see a trend line or a popular will that wants to move toward each other?
So right now, I think that the forces that are driving fracturing and fragmentation are intensifying. And with the combination of automation, the changes in the labour market, the continuing changes in social media, I think that those forces are going to continue to grow stronger. So the pressures on our society to divide us will grow stronger. In response to that, we have to make sure that we're not stuck in a position where it's American pride and nationalism and a proud national identity versus immigration. The thing that can change this story, and we've done a partnership with the National Immigration Forum, 27 cities across the country, the living room conversations. Some people in this room have been involved in them. And we've really got this message from that. It's this story of a proud and inclusive identity that celebrates immigration as always part of making the country a great country, an inclusive country, a country that doesn't abandon its identity, that it doesn't need to be this sort of choice of immigration or being American. In fact, that's what being American means. I think that there remains power in that message. We've done studies across the world, several different countries. No country in the world has got such a strong, powerful, compelling story about immigration than the United States has. But right now, it feels like we're almost falling out of our own story in the moment that we're in. But I still have optimism that it's a powerful and resonant enough story for it to be recovered.
Great. Thank you so much. Thanks, everybody. Thank you for coming.